You're staring at an Iron Maiden in a museum, its spikes glinting with menace. It screams medieval torture, but what if it's all a lie? A 19th century fake sold as history. Let's uncover the truth behind this terrifying myth. Chapter 1. The Iron Maiden's terrifying image. The Iron Maiden is one of history's most iconic symbols of torture. It's a human-shaped metal coffin, lined with sharp spikes, designed to pierce its victim as the door slams shut. You've probably seen it in movies, video games, or even heavy metal album covers. Its grim reputation precedes it. But where did this horrifying contraption come from, and why do we associate it with the brutal Middle Ages? In this chapter, we'll dive into the Iron Maiden's cultural footprint, explore why it's so deeply embedded in our imagination, and set the stage for questioning its origins. Let's start with the image itself. The Iron Maiden is instantly recognizable. A tall, coffin-like structure, often adorned with a grimacing face or eerie carvings, its interior bristling with spikes. Pop culture loves it. Think of films like Sleepy Hollow or games like Assassin's Creed, where it's a go-to prop for medieval menace. It's the ultimate symbol of a dark, barbaric past, evoking a time when justice was cruel and punishment was theatrical. But this vivid imagery isn't just a Hollywood invention. It's rooted in a story that's been told for centuries. The question is, how much of that story is true? To understand the Iron Maiden's grip on our imagination, let's consider why torture devices fascinate us. They tap into a primal fear, being trapped, helpless, and subjected to unimaginable pain. The Iron Maiden, with its claustrophobic design and promise of slow, piercing death, is a perfect embodiment of that dread. It's no wonder museums display replicas, drawing crowds eager for a glimpse of history's horrors. But here's the kicker. While the Iron Maiden feels like it belongs to the gritty reality of medieval dungeons, there's little evidence it was used back then. So, how did this gruesome device become a historical fact? The answer lies partly in how stories spread. In the Middle Ages, tales of torture were often exaggerated to demonize enemies or justify political power. Rulers and chroniclers loved a good horror story to make their opponents seem monstrous. Fast forward to the 18th and 19th centuries, and Europe was gripped by a fascination with the barbaric past. Writers, historians, and showmen began crafting tales of medieval cruelty to captivate audiences. The Iron Maiden, with its theatrical flair, fit perfectly into this narrative. It was shocking, memorable, and just plausible enough to stick. Before we move on, let's think about why this matters. If the Iron Maiden wasn't a real medieval device, why do we believe it was? And who benefits from keeping this myth alive? These questions will guide us as we dig deeper into the origins of this so-called torture device. In the next chapter, we'll travel back to the Middle Ages to explore what torture actually looked like and whether the Iron Maiden has any place in that history. Stick with me as we separate fact from fiction and uncover the truth behind this chilling legend. Chapter 2. Torture in the Middle Ages. What was real? We've established that the Iron Maiden's terrifying image looms large in our minds, but does it belong in the medieval world? To find out, let's step into the actual dungeons and courtrooms of the Middle Ages to explore what torture was really like. This chapter will uncover the tools, methods, and motivations behind medieval punishment, giving us a clearer picture of whether something as elaborate as the Iron Maiden fits into this era's grim reality. The Middle Ages, roughly spanning from the 5th to the 15th century, were no stranger to harsh punishment. Torture wasn't just about inflicting pain, it was a tool for control, confession, and public spectacle. Imagine a crowded town square. A thief might have their hand chopped off, or a heretic could face branding with a hot iron. These punishments were designed to deter crime and reinforce the power of the church and state. Torture was often practical, not theatrical. Common methods included the rack, which stretched the body until joints dislocated, or the thumbscrew, a simple device that crushed fingers to extract confessions. These tools were brutal but straightforward, relying on raw pain rather than elaborate engineering. Let's look at a real example. In 1307, the Knights Templar faced accusations of heresy from King Philip IV of France. Interrogators used methods like strappado, tying a victim's hands behind their back and hoisting them by a rope, often dislocating their shoulders. This was effective, cheap, and didn't require a fancy spiked coffin. Court records from the time detail these methods meticulously, but there's a curious absence of anything resembling an Iron Maiden. Why? Because medieval torture prioritized efficiency and accessibility. Building a complex human-shaped metal device would have been costly and time-consuming in an era when blacksmiths were busy forging swords and armor. Another key point is the role of confession. The Catholic Church, especially during the Inquisition, saw torture as a path to spiritual salvation. If a heretic confessed, they might be spared eternal damnation. Tools like the witch's chair or waterboarding, water over a cloth-covered face, were used to break the accused quickly. These methods were horrifying but didn't need the dramatic flair of an Iron Maiden. Plus, public executions, like burning at the stake, were far more common for those deemed guilty, serving as a visible warning to others. The idea of a secret, spiked coffin just doesn't align with the public, utilitarian nature of medieval justice. So, where does the Iron Maiden fit in? Spoiler, it doesn't. Historical records, from trial documents to chroniclers' accounts, lack any mention of such a device. If it existed, you'd expect to find it in the detailed inventories of torture tools kept by institutions like the Spanish Inquisition. Instead, we see lists of ropes, irons, and simple machines, nothing as ornate as a spiked sarcophagus. This absence raises a big question. If the Iron Maiden wasn't a medieval reality, when and why did it appear? That's what we'll explore next, as we shift to the 18th and 19th centuries, where a fascination with the Dark Ages gave birth to some creative storytelling. Stay tuned for the next chapter, where we'll uncover how the Iron Maiden's myth took root. Chapter 3. The Enlightenment and the birth of the myth. Now that we've seen how medieval torture was brutal but practical, let's fast forward to the 18th and 19th centuries to uncover how the Iron Maiden story took shape. This was a time when Europe was obsessed with reimagining the Middle Ages, not as they were, but as a dark, exotic contrast to the enlightened present. In this chapter, we'll explore how thinkers, writers, and showmen crafted the Iron Maiden's myth, turning it into a symbol of a barbaric past that may never have existed. The Enlightenment, starting around the late 17th century, was all about reason, progress, and shaking off the shackles of superstition. But it also sparked a strange fascination with the so-called Dark Ages. Educated elites loved to paint the medieval period as a time of ignorance and cruelty, a way to pat themselves on the back for living in a civilized era. This mindset set the stage for exaggerating or outright inventing stories about medieval horrors. Enter the Iron Maiden, perfect prop for this narrative. Its gruesome design was just shocking enough to captivate an audience eager for tales of a savage past. One key figure in this story is Johann Philipp Siebenkees, a German philosopher who, in 1793, wrote about a device called the Eiserne Jungfrau, or Iron Maiden. He described it as a medieval execution tool used in Nuremberg, complete with spikes and a hinged door. Sounds familiar, right? But here's the catch. Binkies wasn't reporting history, he was likely speculating or embellishing. His account lacks primary sources, and no records from Nuremberg's courts or execution logs mention such a device. Yet, his description caught on, spreading through books and lectures as fact. Why? Because it fit the Enlightenment's caricature of the Middle Ages as a brutal, backward time. This myth gained traction thanks to the 19th century's love for spectacle. Museums and traveling shows, like those run by showmen such as P.T. Barnum, thrived on shocking exhibits. They displayed authentic torture devices to draw crowds, often with little regard for historical accuracy. A supposed Iron Maiden from Nuremberg, possibly inspired by Binky's tale, became a star attraction. These displays were less about truth and more about profit. Think of them as the clickbait of their day. People flocked to see these horrifying relics, reinforcing the idea that the Middle Ages were a torture fest. But why did the Iron Maiden stick? It was a masterclass in storytelling. Its design was simple enough to imagine, yet complex enough to seem plausible as a medieval invention. Plus, it tapped into a universal fear of being trapped and pierced. Writers and historians kept the myth alive, repeating Binky's claims without digging deeper. By the mid-19th century, the Iron Maiden was cemented in the public's mind as a medieval reality, even though no archaeological evidence or contemporary accounts supported it. As we wrap up this chapter, we're left with a question. How did a made-up device become so believable? The answer lies in the power of storytelling and the human urge to sensationalize the past. In the next chapter, we'll dive into the role of 19th century museums and exhibitions in turning the Iron Maiden into a global icon. And we'll meet the people who profited from its chilling allure. Keep watching as we peel back more layers of this historical hoax. Chapter 4: Museums and the Rise of the Iron Maiden Spectacles. The Iron Maiden's myth taking root in the 18th and 19th centuries. Let's now step into the world of Victorian-era museums and traveling exhibitions. These were the stages where the Iron Maiden transformed from a dubious story into a tangible, terrifying relic. In this chapter, we'll explore how showmen and curators capitalized on the public's fascination with the gruesome, turning the Iron Maiden into a star attraction and cementing its place in popular imagination. The 19th century was a golden age for spectacle. Industrialization brought wealth and leisure, and people craved entertainment that shocked and thrilled. Museums, especially in Europe, weren't just for art or science. They were like modern-day horror shows, displaying curiosities to draw. Crowds' torture devices were a big hit. A so-called Iron Maiden, often billed as a medieval artifact, became a must-see exhibit. One famous example is the Nuremberg Virgin, a supposed Iron Maiden displayed in the 1800s. Curators claimed it was a relic of medieval cruelty, but there's no evidence it was anything more than a prop crafted to amaze and terrify. These displays were masterfully staged. Picture a dimly lit room, a heavy iron contraption looming in the center, its spikes catching the flicker of gas lamps. Visitors would gasp, imagining the agony of its victims. Showmen leaned into this drama, weaving tales of sadistic executioners and doomed prisoners. They didn't need proof. Exaggeration sold tickets. For example, the Castelli collection, a traveling exhibit in the late 19th century, showcased torture devices alongside wax figures and gruesome reenactments. The Iron Maiden fit perfectly, its theatrical design making it a crowd favorite. But these exhibits rarely cited historical sources, relying instead on the public's willingness to believe in a barbaric past. Let's consider the mechanics of this deception. Creating an Iron Maiden wasn't cheap, it required skilled metalwork and design. In the Middle Ages, such resources were reserved for practical things like weapons or armor, not elaborate torture devices. Yet, in the 19th century, craftsmen had the means and motive to build these relics for profit. Some were outright fakes, while others were loosely inspired by real objects, like spiked cages used for public shaming, not execution. These cages, like the gibbet for displaying corpses, may have sparked the Iron Maiden idea, but they were far less lethal. Showmen blurred these lines, passing off their creations as historical fact. The impact was huge. These exhibitions didn't just entertain, they shaped how people viewed history. The Iron Maiden became a symbol of medieval savagery, feeding into a narrative that the past was a brutal, uncivilized nightmare. This wasn't just about profit. It reflected a cultural need to distance the modern world from its roots. By the late 1800s, the Iron Maiden was in history books, novels, and even early films. Its myth now indistinguishable from truth for many. So, what's the takeaway? The Iron Maiden's rise wasn't about evidence, it was about showmanship and storytelling. Museums and exhibitions gave it a physical form, making the myth feel real. But how did this fabricated device spread beyond Europe to become a global icon? In the next chapter, we'll explore how literature, art, and early media carried the Iron Maiden's legend across borders, embedding it deeper into our collective psyche. Stay with me as we follow this Twisted Tales global journey. Chapter 5. The Iron Maiden goes global. With the Iron Maiden now a star in 19th century museums, its chilling legend was ready to spread far beyond Europe's borders. In this chapter, we'll trace how literature, art, and early media carried the myth across the world, turning a fabricated device into a global symbol of medieval horror. We'll see how storytellers and artists amplified its gruesome allure, embedding it in the cultural imagination from London to New York and beyond. The 19th century was a time when stories traveled fast. The rise of the printing press and mass literacy meant books, newspapers, and magazines could reach huge audiences. Writers seized on the Iron Maiden's shock value, weaving it into Gothic novels and sensational histories. For example, in 1837, the English translation of Johann Christian August Claris's book on torture mentioned the Nuremberg Virgin, describing it as a medieval execution device. Though lacking evidence, such accounts were repeated in popular works like Charles Mackay's Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions in 1841, which thrilled readers with tales of historical cruelty. These books didn't just inform, they entertained, feeding a growing appetite for dark, exotic tales. Art played a huge role, too. Painters and illustrators, especially in the Romantic movement, loved depicting the Middle Ages as a time of mystery and terror. Engravings in magazines showed spiked coffins with tortured victims, their faces twisted in agony. These images were often pure imagination, but they stuck in readers' minds. Think of it like viral content today. A single, striking illustration of an Iron Maiden could spread through newspapers across Europe and America, each reprint making the myth feel more real. By the late 1800s, the Iron Maiden was a go-to image. For anyone wanting to evoke a barbaric past, then came early media. The dawn of photography and, later, film brought the Iron Maiden to life in new ways. Traveling lecturers used lanterns slide-surly projectors to show images of torture devices to packed audiences. When motion pictures emerged in the early 20th century, the Iron Maiden made cameo appearances in silent films, often as a prop in historical dramas or horror shorts. These visuals were powerful. Seeing a real Iron Maiden on screen, even in a fictional setting, convinced people. It was a historical fact. American audiences, in particular, ate it up, as the myth fit neatly into a fascination with Europe's savage history. The global spread wasn't just about entertainment, it was cultural. In the United States, for instance, the Iron Maiden resonated with a young nation eager to define itself against the old world's supposed backwardness. Museums like the Eden Museum in New York displayed torture devices, including Iron Maidens, alongside wax figures of infamous criminals. These exhibits drew thousands, each visitor leaving with the myth further embedded. Meanwhile, in colonial regions, European powers used tales of medieval cruelty to justify their civilizing missions, painting their own histories as progressive. By comparison, what's clear is that the Iron Maiden's global reach came from its versatility. It was a story, an image, and a symbol all at once, adaptable to books, art, or early films. Its lack of historical evidence didn't matter, its emotional impact did. As we move forward, we'll dive into how historians and scholars began to question this myth, poking holes in the Iron Maiden's story. In the next chapter, we'll explore the first cracks in the legend and why it took so long for people to challenge it. Keep watching as we unravel more of this historical hoax. Chapter 6. Cracks in the Iron Maiden's mythos. The Iron Maiden's legend spread across the globe. It seemed unstoppable, cemented in books, art, and early films. But not everyone was convinced. In this chapter, we'll explore how historians and scholars in the late 19th and early 20th centuries began to question the Iron Maiden's story, spotting inconsistencies that didn't add up. We'll look at why it took so long for doubts to surface and how the myth's grip on the public imagination made it hard to challenge. The first cracks appeared when historians started digging into primary sources, medieval court records, execution logs, and inventories of torture tools. These documents, preserved in archives across Europe, painted a detailed picture of medieval justice, but they were curiously silent about the Iron Maiden. For example, the meticulous records of the Spanish Inquisition, which catalogued everything, from ropes to branding irons, mentioned nothing like a spiked coffin. Scholars like Henry Charles Lee, who published a history of the Inquisition in 1887, noted that torture devices were practical and well documented, that Iron Maiden was absent. This raised a red flag. If such a dramatic device existed, why wasn't it recorded? Another clue came from archaeology. By the early 20th century, researchers were excavating medieval castles and dungeons, but no Iron Maidens turned up. Compare this to real torture tools, like the rack or pillory, which left physical evidence or detailed descriptions in contemporary accounts. The absence of the Iron Maiden in these findings puzzled historians. Some began to suspect it was a modern invention, possibly inspired by exaggerated tales or misinterpretations of other devices, like the chandemantel, a barrel-like cage, used for public humiliation, not execution. These scholars argued that the Iron Maiden's design was too complex and costly for the medieval world, where resources were scarce. So why did it take so long to question the myth? Part of the answer lies in the power of storytelling. The Iron Maiden was so vivid, so perfectly suited to the narrative of a brutal Middle Ages, that people wanted to believe it. Museums and showmen kept displaying authentic Iron Maidens, and the public, thrilled by the horror, rarely demanded proof. Even historians weren't immune. Many repeated the myth without checking sources, assuming earlier accounts, like Seebinke's 1793 description, were reliable. It was a classic case of confirmation bias. The story felt true, so it was treated as true. Challenging the myth also meant going against a cultural tide. The 19th century's obsession with the Dark Ages made the Iron Maiden a symbol of progress, proof that modern society had moved beyond such cruelty. Questioning it risked undermining this narrative, which was uncomfortable for a society proud of its advancements. Plus, the Iron Maiden's gruesome allure made it a cash cow for exhibitors and publishers, who had little incentive to debunk their own star attraction. Despite these early doubts, the Iron Maiden's myth persisted, fueled by its emotional impact. But the seeds of skepticism were planted, setting the stage for a deeper reckoning. In the next chapter, we'll explore how 20th century historians and pop culture wrestled with the Iron Maiden's legacy, as some tried to debunk it while others kept the myth alive. Stay tuned as we see how this fabricated legend held on in a world starting to demand evidence. Chapter 7: The 20th Century Debunking Meets Pop Culture. As historians began to question the Iron Maiden's existence, the 20th century brought a clash between scholarly skepticism and the myth's enduring popularity. In this chapter, we'll dive into how researchers worked to debunk the Iron Maiden as a medieval torture device, while pop culture through movies, books, and even music kept its legend alive. We'll explore why the myth proved so resilient, even in the face of growing evidence that it was a 19th century fabrication. By the early 20th century, historical research was becoming more rigorous. Scholars like those at the University of London's Vorburg Institute started cross-referencing medieval texts with physical evidence, finding no trace of the Iron Maiden in authentic records. For instance, studies of Nuremberg's criminal justice system, where the Nuremberg Virgin supposedly originated, revealed detailed execution methods like hanging or beheading, but nothing about a spiked coffin. Books like Torture by Daniel Mannix in 1964 openly called the Iron Maiden a myth, pointing out that its earliest mentions came from 18th century writers, not medieval sources. These findings were clear. The Iron Maiden was likely a product of Enlightenment-era exaggeration, not historical fact. But here's where things get tricky. While historians were busy debunking, pop culture was doubling down. The Iron Maiden became a staple in horror films and pulp fiction. Take the 1934 film The Black Cat, where Bela Lugosi's character references medieval torture devices, setting a creepy tone that audiences loved. By the 1960s, B-movies like The Pit and The Pendulum used the Iron Maiden as a shorthand for Gothic terror, its spikes looming in shadowy dungeons. These depictions didn't need historical accuracy, they needed drama, and the Iron Maiden delivered. Even the heavy metal band Iron Maiden, formed in 1975, leaned into the myth, using its imagery in album art and lyrics to evoke raw, rebellious energy. Why did pop culture cling to the myth? It's simple. The Iron Maiden was too good a story to let go. Its visceral horror being trapped in a spiked coffin tapped into universal fears, making it a perfect plot device. Meanwhile, museums continued displaying Iron Maidens, often with vague labels like replica that didn't clarify their dubious origins. Visitors didn't care about the fine print. They wanted the thrill. This created a feedback loop. The more the Iron Maiden appeared in media, the more it felt like historical truth, even as scholars shouted, "It's fake." The tension between fact and fiction reveals something deeper. People love a good story, especially one that paints the past as dark and chaotic. The Iron Maiden fit that narrative, reinforcing the idea that the Middle Ages were a time of unchecked cruelty. Debunking it required not just evidence, but overcoming an emotional attachment to the myth. Historians faced an uphill battle, as the public and even some academics preferred the sensational over the factual. As we close this chapter, we see the Iron Maiden caught in a tug-of-war between truth and entertainment. In the next chapter, we'll look at how modern archaeology and historical reenactments have further exposed the Iron Maiden's flaws, while also exploring why some still defend its existence. Keep watching as we dig deeper into this stubborn legend's hold on our imagination. Chapter 8: Modern Archaeology and the Iron Maiden's Absence. With the Iron Maiden's myth thriving in pop culture despite scholarly doubts, let's turn to the modern era, where archaeology and historical reenactments have put the legend under a microscope. In this chapter, we'll explore how advances in historical research and experimental archaeology have further exposed the Iron Maiden as a fabrication, while also examining why some enthusiasts still cling to its existence. We'll dig into the evidence or lack thereof and see how it reshapes our view of this infamous device. Archaeology in the 20th and 21st centuries has been a game-changer for understanding the past. Excavations of medieval prisons, castles, and execution sites across Europe have uncovered tools like shackles, branding irons, and even fragments of racks, but no Iron Maidens. For example, digs at sites like the Tower of London or Germany's Hohenlohe Castle, known for their grim histories, have yielded detailed artifacts of punishment, yet nothing resembling a spiked coffin. Modern imaging techniques, like ground-penetrating radar, have explored dungeon sites, but the Iron Maiden remains absent. This lack of physical evidence is telling. A device as large and complex as an Iron Maiden would likely leave some trace, yet none has been found. Experimental archaeology, where researchers recreate historical tools or practices, has also cast doubt. Historians like those at the University of Reading have tested medieval torture methods, building replicas of documented devices like the thumbscrew or strappado. These experiments show that medieval torturers favored simple, portable tools that were easy to maintain. An Iron Maiden, with its intricate hinges and custom spikes, would have been a logistical nightmare, expensive to craft and impractical to use. Reenactments at historical festivals, like those in Rothenburg, Germany, stick to verified methods like public floggings, with no mention of spiked coffins in their scripts. These efforts highlight a gap between the Iron Maiden's myth and the reality of medieval technology. Despite this, some enthusiasts argue the Iron Maiden could have existed in rare cases. They point to vague references in 19th century texts or misidentified objects, like spiked cages used for display, not torture. For instance, the Spanish tickler, a spiked tool for raking skin, is sometimes conflated with the Iron Maiden, but it's far simpler and documented in historical records. Online forums and pseudo-historical blogs occasionally defend the Iron Maiden, citing unverified anecdotes or lost artifacts, but these claims crumble under scrutiny, lacking Primary sources. Museums displaying Iron Maidens today, like the Torture Museum in Amsterdam, often admit they're replicas, yet their presence keeps the myth alive for casual visitors. The persistence of belief comes down to human nature. The Iron Maiden's dramatic image is hard to shake, especially when it's reinforced by decades of media. For some, accepting it as a fake feels like losing a piece of history's darker lore. But the evidence is clear. No medieval text, artifact, or excavation supports its existence. Modern archaeology has drawn a line in the sand, showing the Iron Maiden as a product of later imaginations, not medieval dungeons. This brings us to a turning point. With the myth exposed, how do we reconcile its cultural impact with its fictional roots? In the next chapter, we'll explore how the Iron Maiden story reflects broader trends in how we invent and perpetuate historical myths, and what that says about our fascination with the past. Stay with me as we unpack the bigger picture behind this fabricated legend. Chapter 9. Why we love historical myths. With the Iron Maiden exposed as a 19th century fabrication through archaeology and research, it's time to ask, why do myths like this endure? In this chapter, we'll explore how the Iron Maiden story reflects our broader fascination with historical myths and what it reveals about our relationship with the past. We'll dive into the psychology behind our love for gruesome tales and how they shape our understanding of history. Even when they're not true, humans are drawn to stories that evoke strong emotions, and the Iron Maiden delivers. Its image of a spiked coffin taps into deep fears of confinement and pain, making it a perfect vehicle for sensational storytelling. Psychologists call this the negativity bias. We're wired to pay attention to scary or shocking things because they feel urgent and memorable. In the 19th century, when the Iron Maiden myth took off, this bias was exploited by showmen and writers who knew a terrifying tale would stick in people's minds far longer than a dry historical fact. It's the same reason we're drawn to ghost stories or true crime today. The thrill keeps us hooked. The Iron Maiden also fits into a larger pattern of historical myth-making. We love to imagine the past as either gloriously heroic or brutally savage, often exaggerating to make our own era seem better. The Middle Ages, in particular, have been a canvas for this. Take the myth of the Dark Ages itself, a term popularized in the 19th century to suggest a time of ignorance and chaos. In reality, the medieval period saw advances in architecture, law, and science, but the Iron Maiden story helped paint it as a nightmare. This distortion served a purpose. It made modern society feel progressive, rational, and humane by comparison. Another reason myths like the Iron Maiden persist is their adaptability. The story morphed to fit different contexts: Gothic novels, horror films, even heavy metal culture, each version reinforcing its place in our imagination. For example, when the band Iron Maiden used the device's imagery in their 1980s album art, it wasn't about historical accuracy, it was about evoking raw, rebellious energy. Similarly, video games like Castlevania use the Iron Maiden as a creepy prop, not a history lesson. These cultural touchstones keep the myth alive, even as scholars debunk it, because they prioritize feeling over fact. But there's a deeper implication. When we accept myths like the Iron Maiden without questioning, we risk misunderstanding the past. Real medieval torture was brutal enough. Think of documented cases like the execution of William Wallace in 1305, drawn and quartered in a public spectacle. By focusing on fictional devices, we can overlook the actual complexities of history. like how torture was often a tool of political control, not mindless cruelty. Recognizing this helps us see the past more clearly and question the stories we're told today. As we wrap up, the Iron Maiden's enduring appeal shows how much we love a good story, even a false one. In the final chapter, we'll bring it all together, looking at what the Iron Maiden's myth teaches us about history, truth, and why we need to keep questioning the tales we inherit. Stay tuned for the big wrap-up as we close out this twisted journey. Chapter 10. Lessons from the Iron Maiden's Mythweed. VA traced the Iron Maiden's journey from a 19th century fabrication to a global icon, debunked by scholars yet thriving in pop culture. In this final chapter, we'll tie it all together, exploring what this myth teaches us about history, truth, and our need to question the stories we inherit. We'll reflect on why the Iron Maiden matters and how it challenges us to approach the past with curiosity and skepticism. The Iron Maiden's story is more than a historical curiosity. It's a warning about how easily fiction can masquerade as fact. From its murky origins in Enlightenment-era tales to its starring role in museums and movies, the Iron Maiden shows how a compelling story can outshine evidence. This isn't just about one fake torture device. It's about how we construct history. Every era rewrites the past to suit its needs, whether to justify progress, entertain, or sell tickets. The Iron Maiden, born from a desire to paint the Middle Ages as barbaric, reminds us that history is often shaped by those telling the story, not just the facts. Consider a modern parallel. Urban legends or viral hoaxes spread online because they're gripping, not because they're true. The Iron Maiden was the 19th century's version of a viral post, sensational, shareable, and hard to disprove without digging deeper. Today, we have tools like archives, archaeology, and digital databases to check claims, but we still fall for myths when they feel right. For example, the idea that medieval people believed the earth was flat is another persistent myth, debunked by scholars who point to texts like Ptolemy's, widely studied in the Middle Ages. Yet, like the Iron Maiden, it lingers because it fits a narrative of a backward past. So, what can we learn? First, always ask for evidence. The Iron Maiden's absence from medieval records court documents, inventories, or artworks should have raised doubts sooner, but its emotional pull delayed scrutiny. Second, question the storyteller's motives. The showmen, writers, and curators who popularized the Iron Maiden profited from its shock value, just as modern influencers might amplify a story for clicks. Finally, embrace complexity. The Middle Ages weren't a monolith of cruelty. They were a time of innovation, faith, and struggle, far richer than the Iron Maiden's grim caricature suggests. Let's apply this to today. When you hear a dramatic, historical claim, whether about torture devices or ancient conspiracies, pause and dig deeper. Check primary sources, read what scholars say, or even visit a museum with a critical eye. The Iron Maiden's myth shows how easily we can be swayed by a good story, but it also empowers us to seek the truth. By questioning, we honor the past, not as a horror show, but as a complex tapestry of human experience. That's the end of our journey through the Iron Maiden's myth. I hope you've enjoyed unraveling this historical hoax as much as I have. If you found this video fascinating, hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into history's mysteries, and drop a comment below. Tell me, what other historical myths should we tackle next? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.